Hello, welcome to a new episode of the Family Homelessness Information Series. Over the next month, we are going to be exploring the topic of immigrant homelessness. I'm joined today with two new guests. Do you want to introduce yourself?
Certainly. My name is Rebecca McDonald, and I am the Manager of Research and Evaluation at In From the Cold.
And I'm Louise Gallagher. I'm the Interim Executive Director at In From the Cold.
Louise, do you want to give an overview of the immigrant homeless population here at In From the Cold?
So at In From the Cold, we do see a number of families who would fall in the category of immigrants. So they've either come to Canada as newcomers, or perhaps they're refugees, and they could be refugees with status, or they could be refugees without status, which means that they actually are in a process of trying to obtain status to stay in the country. And what we see is approximately 20% of the families we serve at any time during the year would be immigrant families or new immigrants or newcomers or refugees. Some of the reasons people can find themselves in this situation, and it doesn't matter if you're a new Canadian or if you're someone who's been here for a long time, there are many reasons people find themselves in homelessness. In Calgary, one of those reasons would be that perhaps if I am an immigrant family and I have a large family, I can't find housing that I can afford that's of a suitable size. And so I may have been in insecure housing of some form. Perhaps I had a 2-bedroom apartment that was not well cared for by a landlord, and I was paying a fair amount for it, and I've got 4 children. It's not sustainable. Or perhaps what can happen is, as we've seen in the economy, that families lose their jobs. A parent will lose their job, and they're unable to afford to pay for housing. What we see is that whether you're an immigrant family or a family who's been in Canada for their entire life, economic factors impact whether or not they can and do remain housed or are safely housed and securely housed. So all of those kinds of factors, an illness, a breakup of a family, just as they impact singles and other, Canadians, they also will impact immigrant families. The other aspect that we see is that we have refugee families who perhaps they're fleeing war or they're fleeing drought or circumstances in their homeland that have caused them to run for their lives, in essence. And they've come to Canada seeking a better life for their families. In some instances, these families may not have the appropriate paperwork. They may not have come across the border in a way that provided them a refugee status. And so they're in essence looking for asylum and support, and they fear for their lives going back to the countries they came from. But what we also have to remember is that they come with a great deal of trauma, and that can impact their ability to settle in their new homeland.
What is In From the Cold doing to better assist new Canadian families?
What we recognize is that settlement services are an integral part of supporting newcomers to Canada. When a newcomer family ends up in homelessness or a refugee family ends up in the shelter, we have to be able to support them in ways that address their cultural needs, the traumatic experiences that we know some of them carry, as well as their economic needs in order to find a better life here in Canada. So one of the things we've done is we've established a position for a case manager whose sole responsibility is to work with newcomer and immigrant and refugee families so that she can, in essence, navigate the system of care with them. Because sometimes when you come from another land and the language is foreign to you as well as the customs, it's hard to understand, how do I get the supports I need? What are the supports I need? So in this case, the woman who is doing this is a woman named Tanya. And Tanya's role is to ensure that these families connect to the right resources, to the right people, understand the system, understand what their rights are, understand what they need in order to successfully settle in their new land.
So how do these families adjust after receiving assistance from In From the Cold?
One of the things we measure a lot here at In From the Cold is resiliency in children and adults and of the family unit. what we find with many of the refugee families, in particular as well as new immigrants, is that they truly have come to find a safer way of life and a place to make a home. And so we find in many instances that their length of stay in shelter is shorter because they are so focused on establishing themselves in community. Plus, Calgary has a very rich and vibrant multicultural community. So they can connect in to their cultural community here in Calgary, which will support them in also establishing roots. And so what we see is that their focus is, how do I get a job? How do I get housing? How do I move out of shelter quickly? Because they want to establish deep roots in the community, and the best way to do that is to be in community. So I think it's also important, though, to put this in context of, the families who come here, like all of us, whether they're a new immigrant family or new Canadian or Indigenous family or non-Indigenous, whatever their ethnic background, families come because they are seeking a better way of life for their children, or because whatever was happening in their life has caused them to lose their roots in community. For all the families who come here, the goal is to connect them to the right resources at the right time so that they can get into the right housing as quickly as possible. Because the thing we recognize is that shelter is not their home. Shelter is that stepping off point to their new way of life, regardless of what their background is. With refugee and new immigrants, they come with that mindset of, this is why we've come to Canada. Something's broken down in their settlement process, and that's how they've ended up in shelter. But they bring their resiliency with them, the thing that got them all the way from whatever country they came from. For some families, regardless of their ethnic background, the challenge is that long-term poverty limits their capacity to actually make some of the changes necessary. So they don't see that same possibility of creating a new life because they've always been mired in poverty, and they don't actually recognize and have the resiliency necessary to just immediately move on. So that's where we just provide the supports to ensure that they can connect in to the right resources.
Rebecca, you have been spearheading the information reports that we recently just started publishing. So last month was on Indigenous homelessness, and the upcoming one will be on immigrant homelessness. Can you highlight some of the major learnings from the new information report?
Yes, absolutely. One of the things that came out of the research is that immigrants and refugees are some of the fastest growing groups, subgroups of the homeless population in Canada, which, we can draw a comparison with family homelessness in that respect. But they are affected by very different barriers to housing stability. There are a number of socioeconomic barriers that are specific to newcomers to Canada, barriers that they would face in getting settled, in maintaining economic stability, housing stability, those kinds of things. And in particular, one of the biggest things to me that was of interest was that when we compare different cohorts of new immigrants to Canada over time, we see that there is an increasing income gap when newcomers first come to Canada. So newcomers now are making a lot less when they first come to Canada than they did, say 15 years ago. And the gap between how much newcomers make and how much the Canadian-born make, that gap doesn't close as quickly as it used to. So that is one of the biggest, primarily economic factors that affects folks when they first arrive in Canada. You don't make it you don't make as much money, and so that doesn't leave you with as much money to cover your basic needs, right? In Calgary specifically, there was a 2009 report done, and they specifically noted, and I quote, "The gap between the immigrant employment rate and that of non-immigrants has widened. Immigrant unemployment rates remain higher than that of non-immigrants." So that's pretty troubling when you think of that this is one barrier of many that some newcomers face when they come to Canada. Also, Calgary is a top destination right now for newcomers to Canada. We have had an almost 32% increase in immigrant settlement between 2006 and 2016. So you can imagine that it could be a little more difficult for folks when they arrive to get established and settled. As you might imagine, another barrier for folks when they're first arriving are difficulties entering the job market, and that can run the gamut from language barriers, as you touched on, foreign credentials not being recognized, and discrimination in the workforce, which many research studies have demonstrated that folks have perceived to be discriminated against when entering the workforce in Canada, particularly if they're a visible minority. And there, something that you touched on, Louise, that I thought was really salient and did come up in the research were that there are difficulties navigating complex systems. When you're a newcomer to Canada, many folks face, a language barrier, don't understand the rights that are afforded to them, maybe in terms of your rights as a tenant, or more generally, you may be coming from a country where things were really difficult and you didn't have that many rights. So you may not understand the amount of rights that are afforded to you in Canada. So navigating these complex systems of the law system, the tenancy system, those kinds of things can be very difficult and be prohibitive. And if you are unable to have someone support you in understanding those things, you may just not be able to engage.
How can the situation improve for new Canadian families?
Absolutely. And Louise touched on one of the most important things, and that is affordable housing. According to all the research that I've read, affordable housing is an essential component of sustainable settlement for newcomers to Canada. And we know in Calgary that there is a significant lack of appropriate affordable housing for folks. And that's the Canadian-born and newcomers. So that is, we see, on all levels of government, this is being addressed, but we're still not at a place where the appropriate amount of housing is available. I think also something that came up at least a couple of times was better coordination of services and coordination of care between organizations and institutions. And I think the role that Tanya is playing, specifically serving folks, newcomer families that come to us, is a really helpful role in that respect, in helping people connect to the services they need and helping people to understand, what their rights are.
What supports are available for new Canadians, and also what supports are lacking?
I think in Calgary, we have a pretty robust immigrant serving system of care. There are an incredible amount of nonprofits that do really amazing work. Some of the main, agencies that I would think of right away are the Center for Newcomers, Immigrant Services Calgary, are very focused on settlement and integration for newcomers to Canada. The City of Calgary and the Government of Alberta both have, a guide for newcomers to Canada, which includes quite a bit of information on services available. Although when looking at these resources, I did notice on the City of Calgary website it's only available in English and Arabic, and it seemed that on the Government of Alberta site I could only access that, resource in English. So that may serve as kind of a barrier in itself. But those resources do exist, and someone could be supported in getting that information through translation or something like that. Calgary Public Library is another great resource with all kinds of free workshops and classes on English as a second language, citizenship and immigration, how to get your citizenship knowledge up to date for your tests, those kinds of things.
But the challenge remains, it's the navigation of the system.
Yes.
That's challenging for people if they don't speak the language, if the culture is such that only the head of household, which is a man, can access or talk to people, and it's not okay for the female. And you have these cultural differences that can impede someone's ability to settle and to integrate into community. So all of those pieces have to be considered. And to give you an example of how this can play out is if you take a woman who came to the inn some months ago, she had a small child, 2-year-old with her. She was pregnant, did not speak English. She had been sponsored in Canada by her husband. It was an arranged marriage from her town of birth. And the language she spoke was quite uncommon. So when she arrived here, no one could even speak to her to understand how it was that a taxi had brought her here with this young child by herself. And so we had to get Language Line, which is another facility, but it involves a payment. It involves money to pay for this. So we've got an agreement with Language Line. So we found somebody who spoke her language to discover that she was fleeing her husband. So she's fleeing a domestic violence situation. She's coming here to a shelter that is not a domestic violence shelter, but she feels safer here because there are some people from her home country here. And at the same time, she's already put her immigration status in jeopardy because she's not with her immigration sponsor, who is her husband, who is holding on to all her paperwork. So all of these things have to be navigated very carefully. We have to make sure we bring in the right resources to connect this woman so that she can continue on in Canada legally, because she doesn't want to be here illegally. So the nuances in this are significant. And for her, it was for this little 2-year-old child that she wanted to ensure that the child had the life that she envisioned when she first came here.
And Louise, in the research that I've been doing, from a gender perspective, these socioeconomic barriers that I was talking about are compounded for women, especially vulnerable women in the situations like you are talking about.
Yeah. Well, and in fact, if you think about, if I'm a Muslim woman and I never have my head bare in front of men or in public, and I'm staying on our shelter floor where there are men, I can never take my head dress up, my hijab off. I can't do it because it is not my culture. And so that complexity is added to the trauma and stress. And I think that's the piece that we always have to keep in mind, is that people bring trauma. And what we try to do in shelter is mitigate against adding to that trauma. And yet sometimes because of cultural insensitivities that we can't overcome because of the makeup of a family shelter, we need to be able to find different solutions. And as an example, we're talking with a group of that. Maybe what we have are some special apartment units set up that we can move an immigrant family into as a transition, so that it's a faster way for them and a safer, more secure way for them to move into community and integrate into community without ever having to enter shelter. Our goal would always be to have families housed and never have to enter shelter. That would be the dream for everyone.
You both kind of touched on this, but the population of families who utilize services here at In From the Cold is very diverse. How are we ensuring all of these families have a voice here and making sure that all of these different voices are helping us to provide the highest quality of care we can to families who are in crisis?
On a broad scale, it's simple things like food. So we know that we have families who don't eat pork. So our kitchen keeps a track of, and guests are asked, what are your food preferences? What are the foods you're allowed to eat? What you're allergic to? So we keep track of that. And our kitchen actually does its best to ensure that those food needs are being met. Food is a staple, and it's the piece that, connects us and grounds us. We sit around the table and we share a meal. And so just on that very simple level, we're doing our best to ensure that we're addressing some of those cultural and faith-based and significances that people need. It also includes things like recognizing that, as we have done with with our Indigenous families, that we bring in an elder. We also try to connect families to their cultural groups out in community and to their faith groups out in community to ensure that they have access to what they need to feel that they are at home in Canada and in Calgary. And then there's some other things that Rebecca has some really exciting news on that we're implementing.
Is a family advisory board. As you're mentioning, we want to make sure that the diverse views and the diversity of our shelter is represented in the policies that we enact. So what we are endeavoring to do is create a board of folks who have either lived in the shelter or have been a part of our housing programs, such as Journey House 1 and 2, to basically act as an advisory board for the inn. Folks with lived experience, and folks who know our context. They can bring concerns to the board, and they will also play a part in developing future policy for the inn as a whole. So that is a really important part, I think, of where we're going in the future, is to make sure that we are including the voices of the people we serve, because fundamentally they're the most poised to feel the impacts of those services. And the foundation of the Family Advisory Board is nothing about us without us.
That's beautiful.
And what nothing about us without us means is that, when we are structuring a trauma-informed shelter that is housing-focused, it means that we are not triggering trauma simply through things like the color of the walls or the food we serve, or not understanding some of the cultural aspects of the guests. So that what this Family Advisory Board will be able to do is inform our trauma-informed practices, which is pretty exciting.
Absolutely.
Have you had the first meeting yet?
No, we are just about to engage in the recruitment process. So we will be following up with folks who have expressed an interest across the shelter, in housing, in community, and in the Journey houses. We anticipate that we may have our first meeting in January, hopefully. We want to make sure we do it right. So,
If people are interested in learning more on this subject or advocating for better supports for new Canadians, what do you both recommend they do? What are their first steps?
To understand the complexity of immigration from the perspective of being a new Canadian, and then the overlaying of that of homelessness. And when those two worlds collide, something's gone desperately wrong in the settlement process. And so to get a better understanding of that, to come to the shelter, have a tour, talk to the staff and the people and find out, learn more.
and I think advocating for affordable housing, there is a movement right now towards like a housing first philosophy and developing more affordable housing. But we really need to keep the push behind that to make sure that all levels of government follow through, because we want to make sure everybody has a place that's safe, that they can call home.
Mm-hmm. Great.
And then we have a big dream, right? And our big dream is to have enough housing that we can move families quickly through shelter, or we can divert them before they ever come to our doors. And to do that, we have to have the right resources to ensure that they can retain the housing. Because if you think about it, if a newcomer family is here and they're in housing, as long as that housing is safe, then keeping them in that housing is way better than having them turn up at the shelter door. So having the right diversions in place that we can support them and staying in housing. And that includes working with other agencies, obviously, to ensure that they're connected in where they need to be connected in to get the resources they need.
Well, thank you both. This has been a great introduction to immigrant homelessness and the complexities of this subpopulation of the homeless population. We have interviews coming up with Immigrant Services Calgary and Centre for Newcomers, so look out for those in the upcoming weeks. As well, look forward to the second volume of our information report, which will be available online on our website. Thank you both.
Thanks, Kara.
Thanks, Kara.
Visit our website to download In From the Cold's 3-year strategic plan and our 2017 report to community.